Usually when we talk about a structural foundation, right? Like, let's say you're looking at a skyscraper or a massive suspension bridge, or I don't know, even just the electrical grid that keeps your lights on.
Right, the stuff we rely on every day.
Exactly. There's this underlying expectation of just absolute uncompromising precision.
Because there has to be.
Right. Like engineering. You calculate the load, you pour the concrete, the steel holds the tension, and the architect or the engineer, they can just point to the math on the blueprint and say, there it is. That's why the building stands.
Yeah, it's a completely binary reality. I mean, it's entirely grounded in physics, so it either works or it doesn't.
Right. It holds the weight or it collapses. It's clean, it's brutal, and honestly, it's comforting in a way.
It is, yeah.
Because we like things to be empirically verifiable. We like them to be categorized by the rigid laws of nature. Because, when you drive across that bridge, you really don't want the engineers to have prioritized, like, the vibe of the steel over its actual tensile strength.
Oh, absolutely not. You want the cold, hard data.
You want the data. But, and this is where today's deep dive comes in. If you step into the world of modern corporate boardrooms or, modern academia, HR departments, government bureaucracies, suddenly, according to the source material we are immersing ourselves in today, that foundational math is just gone.
Right. It's been completely replaced.
Yeah. We're looking at a structural landscape that is allegedly replacing the steel of objective reality with the shifting, highly volatile sands of emotional subjectivity.
Yeah.
And the terrifying part, the book we are looking at claims this isn't an accident at all.
No, he argues it's a controlled demolition.
Exactly.
Which is just the absolute definition of an ideological earthquake. And that is exactly the architecture we are going to dissect today.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at a highly provocative, just unapologetically polarizing new ebook. It's called Wokezis, Dark Triad Leftism of Gynofascist Marxism.
Quite the title.
Yeah, by Conrad Riker, published in 2026. And this is a text that does not pull a single punch.
It really doesn't. It is remarkably dense, and it reads less like a traditional political commentary and more like a tactical schematic of a cultural war.
It really does. Now, if you are a listener who is fascinated by the ideological history of our institutions, specifically understanding how they operated before their alleged capture by what the author describes as a coalition of feminists and Marxists, this deep dive is completely custom built for you.
Yeah, especially if you are in the men's rights or red-pilled spaces, you are going to hear a lot of familiar concepts here.
Oh, tons.
But they're elevated to a level of formal logic that is genuinely startling.
Startling is a good word for it. But hey, before we unpack the mechanics of this, please take a second to hit like and subscribe. It really, really helps us keep bringing you these ultra-long, in-depth analyses.
Definitely.
And if today's exploration hooks you, and I think it will, you can grab your own copy of the ebook right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. We'll remind you again at the end, but trust me, you're going to want to see this blueprint for yourself.
And I think it's crucial to frame exactly how we're approaching this text today. Because, like you said, this is an incredibly polarizing manifesto.
Right.
So our goal today isn't to take a side or to endorse or to condemn any of this.
Exactly. We're acting as a neutral lens.
You're right, a neutral lens. We are going to neutrally explore the author's exact arguments, the syllogisms, and the worldview he presents so you can see exactly how the logic of this perspective is built from the ground up.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Exactly.
Well said. We're pulling the engine apart to see how the pistons fire. And Riker argues that the engine of the modern West effectively threw a rod and broke down on a very, very specific date. He doesn't point to a vague decade or some, broad cultural shift. He points to August 5, 2017.
Right, the day Google fired James Dunmore.
Yeah. Now, obviously, our audience knows the basic history here.
Sure.
Dunmore was a software engineer who wrote this internal memo, very politely titled, I might add, Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, where he cited evolutionary psychology to explain the gender disparity in tech.
Right.
But Riker doesn't just treat this as another entry in the, culture war, cancel culture encyclopedia. He treats it as the Archduke Ferdinand assassination of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, he really centers it.
So why? Why put so much weight on this one specific HR firing?
Because for Riker, the Dunmore incident is the perfect, crystallized microcosm of the entire Wokezis pathogen, as he calls it.
Okay, lay that out for us.
Well, think about the environment, right? You have Google, which is arguably the pinnacle of male systemizing engineering competence.
The ultimate meritocracy, supposedly.
Right. A company built entirely on ruthless algorithms and objective data. And Demore, operating under the assumption that he is in an Enlightenment-style marketplace of ideas, presents peer-reviewed empirical data.
Right, he literally brings a spreadsheet to a vibe fight.
Exactly. He suggests that, hey, perhaps the disparity in software engineering isn't a shadowy patriarchal conspiracy, but simply biological differences in standard deviations of interest. Specifically, the data that men on average prefer working with things and women on average prefer working with people.
And if we look at the actual reaction, the book argues it wasn't a debate about the data at all.
Not even a little bit.
Like nobody came back with a counter spreadsheet.
No, Riker describes the corporate reaction as a literal systemic panic and a collective female neurosis. He actually goes into the etymology of the word hysteria here.
Oh yeah, the Greek root.
Right, it comes from the Greek word hystera, which means womb.
Right.
And Riker's argument is that the modern corporate HR department has become this heavily insulated artificial womb, completely divorced from the harsh realities of the free market.
Wow.
Yeah, and when that insulated environment was pierced by the cold, sharp scalpel of male empirical data, it rebelled violently.
It's such a visceral image.
Yeah.
And he introduces this concept to explain the psychology behind that violent rebellion. He calls it ontological fragility.
Yes, that's a core concept.
Unpack that for me, because it seems completely central to understanding why people in these institutions react to data as if it were a physical threat.
Sure. So ontology is the philosophical study of being, right? Of existence.
Right.
So ontological fragility means that a person's very existence, their identity, is brittle. Riker posits that modern activists have constructed their entire self-worth and their social positioning out of a manufactured victimhood.
Okay.
Their identity literally requires them to be oppressed by a systemic patriarchy. Therefore, their identity is made of glass.
Ah, I see. So, to a mind suffering from ontological fragility, a contrary statistic isn't just an invitation to an academic debate.
No, not at all. It is an existential threat. A fact is literally perceived as a bullet.
A bullet.
Yeah. Because when Demore pointed to empirical data showing that women might just freely choose different careers, the activists didn't hear a statistical average. They heard their entire fragile identity, their victimhood status shattering.
Because if the patriarchy isn't keeping them out of tech,
Exactly. Then their lack of representation isn't oppression. And if they aren't oppressed, they lose their social currency.
that makes so much sense in this framework. Reading that section, I couldn't help but picture the Google town halls that were reported following the memo.
Oh, yeah.
Riker paints this vivid, almost dystopian scene of these hyper-competent male engineers, the guys whose code literally routes the global internet, sitting in obedient silence, completely terrified of losing their jobs, while people wept openly over a 10-page PDF document.
Right.
It feels like a modern-day heresy trial.
And that's exactly the framework Riker uses. It's an inquisition. The data is treated like witchcraft.
But, you know, if I'm trying to follow Riker's logic to its absolute endpoint here,
Yeah, let's take it there.
is he suggesting that any system, whether it's Google or a university or whatever, that prioritizes emotional comfort over raw data is fundamentally anti-truth? Like, by definition.
Yes, absolutely. And he doesn't just state it as an opinion, he maps it out using classical logic. He uses a categorical syllogism, specifically pointing to the form of Barbara.
Hold on. I want to make sure everyone listening is tracking with us.
Yeah.
Categorical syllogism in the form of Barbara. Take me back to Logic 101. What does that actually mean mechanically?
Sure. So in classical Aristotelian logic, Barbara is just a mnemonic device for a specific ironclad type of argument where all three propositions are universal and affirmative.
Okay, so like every A is B.
Exactly. Every A is B, every C is A, therefore every C is B. It's inescapable logic.
Got it.
So Riker sets it up like this. Major premise. Truth inherently corresponds to objective reality.
Right.
Minor premise. The Wokezis ideology explicitly prioritizes subjective emotional narratives over objective reality.
Okay.
Conclusion. Therefore, the Wokezis ideology is an explicitly anti-truth cult.
Wow. It's an airtight logical trap. If you
Yeah.
accept those premises, the conclusion is just inevitable.
Right. Riker argues they literally worship at the altar of the lie. Why? Because their institutional power relies entirely on forcing the competent people to tell lies in order to protect the feelings of the incompetent.
That is heavy.
If you can force a brilliant engineer to look at a biological reality and publicly deny it, You haven't just won an argument, you have broken his will, you have subjugated his mind.
Which leads to a massive structural problem, right? Because if I'm a software engineer listening to this, or a guy working on an oil rig or building a business, my immediate takeaway from Riker's framework is, well, why bother?
Exactly.
And that's exactly the phenomenon Riker identifies as the incompetence void.
Precisely. The incompetence void is the chilling effect of this ongoing inquisition. Riker asks the totally logical question. Why would a brilliant, rational male builder risk his livelihood, his family's financial security, and his reputation to try and fix or optimize a system that openly resents his very DNA?
He wouldn't. The risk-to-reward ratio is completely inverted.
So the predictable outcome is that the competent male simply withdraws his agency. He quiet quits before that was even a term, you know?
Right, he just checks out.
He shuts down his visionary capacity, he does the bare minimum to collect the paycheck and stops innovating. And when the visionary builders step back, the void is immediately filled by what Riker calls HR clerics.
HR clerics.
Administrators whose entire job is policing microaggressions. The institution stops focusing on building the skyscraper and starts focusing entirely on enforcing the vibe in the break room.
Okay, but this raises a huge mechanical question for me.
Sure.
If a society or a corporation abandons objective data and replaces its builders with enforcers of the vibe, how do you actually enforce a subjective reality?
That's the trick.
Because you can't just command people to stop believing their own eyes, right?
Mhm.
You have to change how they process thought. And Riker argues this happens through ontological terrorism, which is a wildly evocative phrase.
It is.
He's talking about the hijacking of grammar itself.
The linguistic invasion. This is perhaps the most crucial tactical pillar in the whole book. You have to understand that Riker views language not just as a tool for communication, but as the operating system of the human mind.
DOS.
Right. He posits that the woke matrix operates by hijacking the dictionary to limit the absolute boundaries of rational thought.
So, before you can imprison the rational male in an emotional padded room, you first have to confiscate the vocabulary he uses to name reality.
Exactly. Riker uses the historical analogy of the Tower of Babel.
Oh, I love this part.
Yeah. If you want to destroy a towering, competent civilization, you don't need siege engines, and you don't need feudal courage to face them on a battlefield. You just confuse their language.
You make it impossible for the architects to speak to the masons.
Right. Riker says every time you accept a redefined word from this ideology, you aren't just being polite, you are surrendering a sovereign province of your own mind.
Let's get incredibly specific with how this works because it's so relevant today. One of his prime examples, and one that trips up a lot of people in the corporate world, is the distinction between equivalence and equity.
This is a foundational distinction, and Riker meticulously severs these two concepts because they are deliberately designed to sound identical while meaning the exact opposite things.
Yeah, people use them interchangeably all the time.
Exactly. Equivalence, he argues, is the classical Enlightenment ideal. It is true equality of opportunity. It's a univocal concept, identical rules for everyone, blind metrics, absolute meritocracy.
It's the stopwatch to track me.
Perfect analogy. The clock doesn't care about your feelings, your background, or your historical grievances. It only cares how fast you ran the mile. Equivalence is the vertical architecture of a fair civilization. It pulls the best to the top.
Right. And then you have equity, which is what he calls the chthonic substitute.
Yes.
Now, just to clarify for everyone, chthonic, meaning underworldly, subterranean, coming from the dirt rather than reaching for the sky. He says equity isn't about opportunity at all. It is the enforced, equalized outcome of parasitic resource extraction.
It's a linguistic trick. And Riker traces this directly back to the Frankfurt School.
Okay, the critical theorists.
Right. The original Marxist framework was purely economic, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. But when that failed to ignite a revolution in the prosperous West, the critical theorists adapted. They shifted from economic Marxism to cultural Marxism.
They changed the battlefield.
Exactly. They took the Marxist envy of success and masked it as a moral virtue. By swapping a few letters, equivalence to equity, they smuggled in a philosophy that demands we chop down the tall trees so the forest is perfectly level. The entire structure of merit collapses.
And this isn't just abstract philosophy either. The book provides a chillingly tangible example of this with the 2021 California Mathematics Framework.
Yes. This is where the chthonic inversion becomes undeniable policy.
I remember reading that part of the book and just stopping to process the sheer hysterical insanity of it.
It's hard to believe until you read it.
Right. Riker points out that the educational apparatus in California allegedly introduced frameworks that rejected the traditional focus on showing one's work or arriving at the single, objective, right answer.
Right, because the frameworks underlying critical pedagogy argued that this rigidity is a hallmark of white supremacy and toxic masculinity.
We are talking about trying to feminize mathematics. 2 plus 2 is 4. It's not 4 because a white man said so. It's 4 because that is the immutable law of the universe.
Exactly.
But the mechanism of their argument is that claiming there is an objective truth is, in itself, a power play by a structural hegemony.
Riker calls this the chthonic helix in action. It is the demand that the mathematically rigid, uncaring nature of the universe be subordinated to emotional validation.
It's wild.
If a student gets the wrong answer, but they use their lived experience to get there, marking them wrong is considered an act of systemic violence.
Which perfectly tees up the redefinition of the word violence, because, if everything is violence, nothing is.
Riker uses reductio ad absurdum here to expose the incoherence of the hijacked language.
Remind us how that works.
Reductio ad absurdum is a logical method where you follow an argument to its absolute absurd logical conclusion to prove the premise is flawed. So the Matrix redefines verbal disagreement as violence. But disagreement is, by definition, the peaceful exchange of non-physical verbal concepts.
Why, it's just talking.
If you redefine that as violence, then the activists who were screaming at James Damore weren't just protesting, they were attempting mass murder.
Right.
By their own standard, every angry tweet is a felony assault.
It perfectly exposes the hypocrisy. The rules only apply in one direction. And this is where he introduces what he calls the Hegel-Satan inversion.
Yes.
I really want to break this down because it sounds like a heavy theological concept, but it's actually a brilliant critique of how debate works today.
Let's look at the classical Hegelian dialectic. In traditional philosophy, you have a thesis, an idea. You introduce an antithesis, a conflicting idea, and through rigorous debate, you synthesize them into a higher, more complete reality.
Right. Iron sharpening iron. You ascend to a better understanding.
Exactly. You move upward, closer to objective truth, the logos. But Riker says this dialectic has been perverted by the Wokezis pathogen.
How so?
The new dialectic doesn't seek a higher truth. It takes an objective truth, the thesis, and a fabricated emotional grievance, the antithesis, and it forces a downward synthesis. It drags objective reality down into the dirt of subjective emotion. It is an inversion.
And this inversion creates the ultimate battleground of the book, which is the war between the factum and the vibe.
Etymology is everything for Riker.
Yeah, he really leans on it.
He explains that the word fact descends from the Latin factum, meaning a thing done. It is an immutable event rooted in physical space and time. It happened.
It's concrete.
But the Matrix has declared total war on the factum. In its place, they elevate the vibe.
So the vibe isn't just like a slang term for a mood in this context.
No.
In Riker's framework, the vibe is a weaponized epistemological tool.
Precisely. It is used to completely bypass the burden of empirical proof. If the sheer intensity of a feeling is fraudulently elevated to the status of empirical fact, you just cannot argue against it with statistics.
Because if I'm grasping this, Riker is basically arguing that by swapping the factum for the vibe, the actual tools of logical debate have been confiscated from men.
Yes.
Like if a doctor points to an angiogram showing a perfectly healthy heart, but the patient feels like they need a quadruple bypass, and the hospital tribunal sides with the patient's lived experience, logic is dead. You can't win.
You can't win because you aren't playing the same game, and this leads to Riker's absolute strategic imperative for the listener.
Right, this is a huge, actionable takeaway from the book.
He states that men must absolutely, under no circumstances, use woke prefixes, pronouns, or terms.
Do not say cisgender. Do not use the word equity when you mean equality.
Right, because the moment you use their language, you have already lost the debate.
You concede the ground.
You concede the epistemological territory. You are accepting the chains of your own subjugation. Riker says you have to force the argument back into the definitional arena of physical reality. You do not use the language of the Matrix.
Okay, this is a fascinating architectural view of the culture. We have a system suffering from ontological fragility, which uses ontological terrorism to hijack the dictionary and replace facts with vibes.
Right.
But, and here's the material reality.
Yeah.
You cannot run a society on vibes.
No, you can't.
The electricity bill still has to be paid. The roads have to be paved. Somebody has to physically fund this massive, emotionally driven HR bureaucracy.
Yes.
And that leads us to what is easily one of the most provocative red-pilled concepts in the entire text. The institutional husband.
This is the pivot point in the book where Riker transitions from cultural critique into hard economic and legal analysis. He asks the question, how does a parasitic system survive?
It has to have a host.
Exactly, it must have a host. He argues that the modern state has undergone a dark metamorphosis into the role of the husband.
Again, going back to the etymology here.
Yes, husband comes from the Old Norse husbandi, meaning master of the house, the provider, the protector. Riker claims the state has usurped this role. It uses its monopoly on violence, meaning the threat of police force and imprisonment, to extract male-generated surplus capital. And it uses that capital to fund the systemic chaos of a single, massive female collective.
He calls the state the beta buck collector.
Yeah.
The mechanism here is profound. He argues that men, by working longer hours, taking more dangerous jobs, and driving the majority of high-yield economic engines, generate a massive surplus of tax revenue.
Right.
The state takes that surplus, and where does it go? It goes to fund female-majority bureaucratic sectors, human resources, expansive public education administration, diversity consulting, and a sprawling welfare apparatus.
Men produce the surplus, the state taxes it, women consume it through institutional salaries and safety nets.
It's a direct transfer.
And to solidify this argument, Riker takes direct aim at the foundational feminist critique of the patriarchy.
Okay, let's get into that.
The standard academic feminist argument for decades has been that men constructed the institutions of society specifically to oppress women and keep them subservient.
And Riker's counter to this is brilliant because he doesn't deny history. He grants the minor premise.
Exactly. He says, yes, absolutely, men built the system. Men built the roads, they dug the sewers, they erected the power grids, they created the legal frameworks.
Yeah.
But he attacks the major premise as a classic material fallacy of false cause.
Break down that fallacy for us.
A false cause fallacy is when you assume that because A happened and B happened, A was done in order to cause B.
Okay.
Feminism assumes men built society in order to oppress women. Riker says this is historical illiteracy. Men didn't build the infrastructure to oppress women. They built it to protect women and children from the brutal, lethal indifference of raw nature.
Oh, yeah.
Before the patriarchy built the electrical grid and the grocery store, nature was a constant state of starvation, disease, and infant mortality.
So the patriarchy was a fortress, not a prison. It was a mutual covenant for survival.
But now the modern state has effectively breached the fortress. It extracts the resources from the men who built it and redistributes them to a system that actively holds those men in contempt.
And nowhere is this extraction more vivid, more localized than in modern family law and the divorce courts.
Oh, absolutely.
Riker views the family court system not as a place of mediation, but as an engine of state-sanctioned wealth extraction.
He spends a significant amount of time on this. And to prove his point, he doesn't use the example of an average blue-collar worker. He goes straight to the absolute top of the hierarchy. He points to Brad Pitt.
Okay, let's talk about the Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie divorce, specifically the Chateau Miraval winery situation.
Right. Riker uses Pitt as the archetype of the apex male. This is a man at the absolute pinnacle of physical attractiveness, cultural status, and financial success.
The top of the pyramid.
Pitt spends years painstakingly building this massive, globally recognized winery estate in France. It is his legacy. It is an empire of competence. Yet, when the marriage dissolves, the legal apparatus treats this empire not as the result of Pitt's singular competence, but as a communal piggy bank to be violently split and weaponized against him.
Because the mechanism of the law assumes that Jolie is inherently entitled to the fruits of his labor simply by virtue of having possessed a marriage license.
And Riker's argument is this. If someone at Brad Pitt's level, an apex male with infinite legal resources, can have his legacy extracted and sold off to vindictive third parties, it proves a terrifying legal reality for the average man.
Which is?
It proves that under the modern Western legal framework, male competence is legally classified as female property.
It makes me think of an analogy. The government-funded girl boss.
That's a great way to put it.
We have this cultural narrative of the fiercely independent, self-made woman who doesn't need a man. But Riker is pointing out that her independence is entirely subsidized by the institutional husband.
Yep.
The roads she drives on, the HR department that employs her, the police force that protects her, and the divorce courts that capitalize her, they are all funded by the invisible extracted labor of men.
The modern marriage license, in Riker's view, is not a sacred covenant before God. It is a legally binding wealth transfer mechanism enforced by the bureaucracy of the state.
But, I want to push back on the framing here, or at least play devil's advocate for the listener for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
Doesn't this perspective require you to view all state welfare, all family courts, and all alimony as intentionally, maliciously parasitic? Isn't it more likely that these are just deeply flawed bureaucracies trying to ensure children don't starve when a marriage fails?
That is the standard defense. But Riker's premise is that, yes, it is intentionally parasitic. It is not a bug, it is a feature. Look at the incentives of a bureaucracy. A bureaucracy only grows if there is a crisis to manage. The state does not want strong, independent nuclear families led by responsible fathers.
Because a self-sufficient family doesn't need the state.
Exactly. If fathers are present, providing and leading, the state has no pretext to intervene, no reason to raise taxes, and no justification to expand its power. The state wants dependent voters and broken homes because managing that fallout requires a massive taxpayer-funded bureaucracy.
It's a self-licking ice cream cone.
Exactly. The system incentivizes divorce through no-fault laws, criminalizes male authority, replaces the father with a government check, and then violently forces the rational male taxpayer to foot the bill for his own obsolescence.
So if I'm a young guy reading this and I'm seeing this architecture laid bare, what is the logical action?
Riker advises the rational male to go Galt.
Referencing John Galt from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged.
Yes. The concept of the most productive, competent members of society simply refusing to participate in their own exploitation. They withdraw their labor.
Right.
Riker says men must legally minimize their tax liability to starve the beast. Furthermore, he argues that signing a marriage contract in the modern West under the current family law regime is an act of monumental irrational risk.
Because you aren't signing a romance document.
No, you're signing a preemptive surrender document to an extractive state.
But here is the genius and honestly the horror of the matrix Riker describes.
Yeah.
If this wealth transfer is so obvious, if the extraction is so blatant, why aren't the men funding it revolting? To keep men compliant while their resources are being drained, the system can't just use brute force. It has to trap them psychologically.
That's the insidious part.
The Matrix has to make you think you deserve to be stolen from. And that takes us into the darkest part of the book. The double bind, Dario, and the death due process.
This is where Riker delves into the deep clinical psychology of the Wokezis matrix. How do you paralyze a rational, systemizing male mind? You use a psychological weapon called a Batesonian double bind.
Okay, we need to spend some time here.
Yeah.
Who is Bateson and what exactly is a double bind? Because this feels like the Rosetta Stone for understanding modern corporate culture.
Gregory Bateson was an anthropologist and systems theorist who did groundbreaking research on communication theory, particularly regarding schizophrenia.
Okay.
A double bind is a communication paradox. It happens when an individual is trapped in a situation where they receive two or more profoundly conflicting messages, and one message explicitly negates the other. Furthermore, the victim cannot simply walk away, and they are forbidden from commenting on the contradiction.
The classic example is a mother who physically stiffens and pulls away when her child gives her a hug, but then verbally says, "Don't you love me? Why are you pulling away?"
Yes.
If the child hugs her, he is rejected physically.
Yeah.
If he pulls away, he is rejected verbally. He cannot win.
Exactly. The mind fractures under the paradox. Now, map that onto the modern corporate HR environment or university campus for a male.
It maps perfectly. You have the primary imperative, the explicit command from the institution. Men must be vocal, compliant allies. You must speak up, use your platform, and check your privilege.
But then you have the secondary implicit injunction. The unwritten rule that guarantees the moment you do actually speak up, the moment you offer a rational thought or a defense, your very voice is immediately attacked as oppressive colonization, tone policing, or mansplaining.
You are commanded to speak, but punished for speaking.
And then the metacommunicative lock seals the trap. You cannot name the paradox.
Right.
If a man stands up in a meeting and says, "Wait, you told me to contribute, but now you're attacking me for contributing," his rational objection is instantly pathologized. The HR cleric will frame his objection as emotional fragility or defensiveness, which they then use as retroactive proof of his underlying guilt.
Riker calls it a schizoid siege. It is deliberately designed to induce psychological exhaustion.
Yeah.
It breaks the male spirit because the male mind relies on logic and consistency, and the double bind is entirely illogical.
It creates a state of learned helplessness. And when a man is actually accused of an infraction in this environment, The Matrix deploys its ultimate defensive mechanism, DARVO.
Deny, attack, and reverse, victim and offender.
Yes, it is a classic behavior of narcissists and abusers, but Riker scales it up to an institutional level.
How so?
When the Matrix is confronted with its own abusive behavior, it denies the behavior occurred, attacks the individual pointing it out, and reverses the roles. So the actual victim is framed as the abuser, and the abuser is framed as the victim.
And the book uses the absolute perfect, globally televised case study for this. The Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial.
It is the ultimate localized manifestation of DARVO and the death of objective truth. Think about the mechanics of that trial. You had empirical, incontrovertible audio recordings, factums, proving beyond any doubt that Amber Heard committed physical, premeditated violence against Johnny Depp.
She literally admits to hitting him on tape.
But the media's immediate reflex wasn't to look at the data.
Not at all. The legacy media and the cultural matrix rely entirely on her subjective emotional performance of victimhood. Riker uses this to illustrate a concept called gamma bias.
Let's explain gamma bias because it's crucial here.
Yeah, explain the mechanism of how that works in the human brain.
Gamma bias is a cognitive distortion, deeply ingrained in our evolutionary psychology, but weaponized by the modern state. It operates on two axes. First, it renders male suffering completely invisible. When a man is harmed, society views it as a natural consequence or his own fault.
Okay, and the second axis.
Second, it minimizes female aggression. When a woman is violent, society either ignores it, excuses it as self-defense, or astonishingly valorizes it as empowerment.
Which is exactly what happened. Even with undeniable audio evidence of her abuse, major publications attempted to paint her as this empowered, terrible mother archetype, a victim of systemic misogyny.
Right.
Riker's point is that the Matrix requires the literal death of objective truth to sustain its power. The narrative of female victimhood must survive, even if it means ignoring a confession on tape.
And we see the systemic death of due process vividly, structurally encoded in the university system through Title IX.
This is a perfect example of how institutions are captured. Title IX started in 1972 as a classic moat.
Explain the Motte and Bailey for the listeners because Riker uses it well here.
Okay, so a Motte and Bailey is a deceptive argument strategy. The Motte is a highly defensible, reasonable position that nobody would argue with. The Bailey is a radical, highly controversial position.
Right.
When you get attacked in the Bailey, you retreat to the Motte and pretend you were only ever defending the reasonable position. So the Motte of Title IX in 1972 was a reasonable guarantee of equal athletic funding and educational access.
Yeah.
Because who is going to argue against letting girls play sports?
Nobody. But then Riker tracks the metastasis. By 2011, with the Obama-era Dear Colleague letter, Title IX expanded into the Bailey. It mutated from sports funding into a sprawling, extrajudicial HR star chamber.
There's a huge shift.
The standard of proof for accusations on campus was artificially lowered from beyond a reasonable doubt to a preponderance of the evidence, meaning 51% certainty.
They literally lowered the bar for justice to appease the believe all women cult.
They turned modern campuses into Kafkaesque arenas. Due process, the right to confront your accuser, the presumption of innocence, the foundational steel of Enlightenment law was vaporized. The accusation itself became the conviction.
I look at the mechanics of these campus tribunals and I compare it directly to the Salem witch trials. It's a horizontal tribunal.
What do you mean by that?
Instead of classical justice, which is vertical, objective, relies on blind evidence and aligns with the logos, you have this flattened, egalitarian mob justice. It is based entirely on the velocity of an accusation and the social status of the accuser.
Riker is showing how the legal framework has been intentionally mutated. It used to be a shield designed to protect objective individual rights. It has been reforged into a sword used to enforce a gynocentric collectivist inversion.
But I want to pause and put myself in the shoes of a guy trying to survive in this. Riker outlines this inescapable double bind. Men are explicitly commanded to be allies, but implicitly guaranteed that if they speak up, they will be attacked. If they're accused, due process is gone, and DARVO is deployed. How does a rational man navigate a system where the very act of defending himself with evidence is treated as proof of his guilt?
The short, brutal answer from Riker's perspective: you cannot navigate it. It is a mathematically rigged game.
You just can't win.
If a man presents empirical evidence of female abuse or institutional bias, the collective hysteria reflexively categorizes the very presentation of that evidence as an act of patriarchal aggression. You cannot logic your way out of a room that has redefined logic as a hate crime.
And just to put the final nail in the coffin of the Matrix's logic, Riker tackles their core foundational myth, the concept of systemic racism and white supremacy.
Right.
And he does it using demographic data.
This is perhaps the most devastating use of formal logic in the entire book. The Wokezis matrix relies on the narrative that the West is structurally designed to subordinate all non-white demographics. To dismantle this, Riker looks at the historical reality of Japanese Americans.
A demographic that suffered actual, literal, state-sponsored systemic racism.
Undeniably. During World War II, Japanese Americans faced mass internment, they were put in camps by the government, and their businesses, homes, and generational assets were totally liquidated. Total systemic reset to zero.
Right.
Yet Riker points out that within just 2 generations, through fierce, unapologetic patriarchal family structures and a relentless dedication to educational meritocracy, they ascended to the absolute top of the American socioeconomic ladder.
He points out the statistical reality that today, the median household income for Asian Americans significantly outpaces that of white Americans.
Right.
So he sets up the syllogism to break the Matrix's narrative.
Premise 1. A true white supremacist hegemony, by definition, structurally subordinates all non-white groups for the exclusive economic benefit of whites.
Okay.
Premise 2. Asian Americans consistently and vastly outperform white Americans economically and academically. Conclusion. Therefore, the United States is not fundamentally structured as a white supremacist hegemony.
The logic is undeniable. He says the entire oppression narrative evaporates under the harsh light of formal demographic data. It proves that meritocracy, the vertical climb of equivalence, actually works when it is applied, regardless of historical grievance.
And that leads directly to the strategic conclusion of the book. If the corporate, legal, and academic systems are a rigged double bind designed to extract your resources, if you cannot win the HR tribunals, and if the foundational narratives of structural oppression are mathematically, statistically false, the only logical response is total withdrawal.
Which brings us to the final sweeping vision of this deep dive. If you can't navigate the matrix and you can't reform it from within because it rejects the factum, you have to exit it entirely.
Riker outlines his ultimate solution: the strict, unapologetic reconstruction of the classical patriarchal logos through the creation of parallel institutions. He calls it the parallel polis.
The parallel polis.
He insists that men must realize they have the power, but they are playing the wrong game. You must stop negotiating with a parasite.
As he puts it, you don't reason with a tick, you walk away.
Exactly. And the ultimate weapon of the rational man in the 21st century is not a firearm. It is his wallet. It is his surplus capital and his unyielding labor.
To prove the kinetic power of this withdrawal, he cites the massive consumer backlash against Target Corporation in 2023. Target pushed a highly controversial Pride collection into the faces of middle America, and the response was instantaneous.
Yeah, it was brutal for them.
Target lost over $10 billion in market capitalization in a matter of days.
Riker points to this not just as a boycott, but as a proof of concept. It is the mathematical fury of the masculine parallel economy flexing its muscle. He uses a vivid metaphor.
What's that?
He says the woke corporation, the captured institution, is a hollowed-out oak tree. It's painted in rainbow colors on the outside, but it is rotting from the inside out. And how do you kill the fungus? You starve it by removing its nutrient source. You remove male capital.
To achieve this on a civilizational scale, Riker advocates for what he calls the monastery strategy.
He draws a brilliant, sweeping historical parallel to Benedict of Nursia. In the year 529 AD, the Roman Empire was in a state of terminal, decadent collapse. It was burning.
Right.
Benedict looked at the burning wreckage, the corruption, the impossibility of reform, and he made a cold, logical decision. Let it burn. He didn't stay in Rome to argue with the politicians. Benedict walked away into the mountains and built a self-sustaining monastery.
He preserved the texts, he preserved the architecture of Western logic, theology, and agriculture, keeping the flame alive while the empire collapsed under its own bloated weight.
And Riker says today, competent men are doing the exact modern equivalent. They are fleeing the burning empire. We are seeing a massive geographic and economic realignment. Men and their families are fleeing high-tax, high-regulation, gynocentric states for competence-oriented, freedom-centric states.
The demographic data backs this up too. Riker notes that California, the epicenter of the Wokezis pathogen, lost over 700,000 residents between 2020 and 2023 alone. Massive capital flight. And these aren't random moves. These are rational actors, the builders, fleeing the human resources state.
And they aren't just moving physically, they are building an intellectual monastery online. Because the legacy university system is entirely captured by the chthonic helix, men are completely bypassing it.
Right.
They are utilizing platforms like Substack, independent lecture series, and decentralized mentorship networks to educate themselves.
They are building parallel economies. You see companies like Jeremy's Razors popping up to replace woke grooming companies that insult their male customer base. You see platforms like Public Ask emerging as an anti-woke Amazon. The infrastructure is being rebuilt from the outside.
Exactly.
Okay, here's where I have to push back on the mechanics of Riker's framework, though.
Sure, let's hear it.
Let's look at the reality of this strategy. He's advocating for building these independent monasteries, using the internet, right? But the internet itself, the AWS servers, the fiber optic cables lying on the ocean floor, the massive payment processing hubs like Stripe and Visa, that is all a system currently controlled and maintained by the very institutional infrastructure he says is captured.
That's a fair point.
If the Matrix controls the servers, is this really a permanent escape? Or is this just a temporary defensive moat that will eventually be breached? How does Riker envision this actually ending? How do the monks win if the Empire controls the water supply?
That is the critical stress test of the book. And Riker's answer bypasses technology entirely. His answer lies in the oldest metric of human survival demographics. He calls it generational conquest by fecundity.
Outbreeding the Matrix.
Exactly. He looks at the macro global data. The nations that originally built the modern world, Britain, Germany, the United States, achieved explosive growth and technological dominance under unapologetic traditional patriarchy. It built the modern era. Conversely, Riker points to the nations that score the absolute highest on modern gender equality and equity metrics today, countries like Sweden, Norway, and Finland. What is happening to them?
They are suffering severe demographic winters.
Their fertility rates are plummeting disastrously below replacement levels. The ultimate outcome of absolute equity, in Riker's view, is demographic suicide. The Wokezis ideology incentivizes narcissism, careerism over family, and the destruction of the nuclear unit.
So he's saying the Matrix is mathematically doomed because a parasite cannot survive if it kills the host, and it cannot survive if it fails to reproduce itself.
Precisely. The woke ideology is a systemic resource drain that cannot survive without the surplus labor of the masculine producer. And it literally cannot sustain its own population.
Right.
Therefore, the strategy in the parallel polis is to build highly functional, hyper-competent monasteries within the decaying framework of the empire, have large traditional families, and simply outbreed the pathogen. Over a 50 to 100-year horizon, demographic arithmetic is undefeated. The future belongs to those who show up for it.
Let the rotting oak tree collapse under the immense weight of its own lies, and be ready to plant new seeds when the ground clears. But to ensure those new institutions don't suffer the same fate, Riker demands a brutal return to classical education. He says men must return to the trivium.
The trivium was the foundational educational model of the West for centuries. It consists of 3 distinct phases. First, grammar, the immutable facts of reality. Second, logic, the mechanisms and relationships connecting those facts. Third, rhetoric, the persuasive, articulate communication of that truth.
You learn what is true, you learn how it works, and then you learn how to defend it.
But Riker points out that the woke matrix completely inverted this sequence.
How so?
They teach students to start with emotional rhetoric, the vibe. They tell them to completely ignore logic, which they call oppressive. And they redefine grammar, the facts, as nothing more than a fluid social construct. It is a recipe for civilizational madness.
To counter this, Riker says men must re-anchor their minds in the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. These are not just subjective opinions or cultural preferences. They are the objective, immovable bedrock of reality. Every institution that denies them is building a skyscraper on shifting sand. Every institution that affirms them is building on rock.
That's the core message.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of architectural ground today. Let's do a quick synthesis.
Good idea.
Riker's Wokezis is an immensely detailed, fiercely uncompromising manifesto. It attempts to arm the rational male with classical, ironclad, syllogistic logic. The goal is to systematically dismantle what the author views as a parasitic, emotionally driven cultural matrix. A matrix that has hijacked the dictionary, weaponized the family courts to extract male capital, and destroyed legal due process through psychological traps like the double bind.
And looking at this structurally, we have to acknowledge the sheer scale and audacity of what Riker has constructed here. Whether you view this ebook as a vital, truth-telling awakening that provides the exact blueprint necessary to save Western civilization, or you view it as a highly aggressive, controversial polemic, it is undeniably a fascinating, comprehensive look into the bedrock architecture of the red-pilled worldview.
Definitely.
It doesn't just complain about the culture, it lays out the exact logical, economic, and psychological mechanics of that perspective.
It really does. It gives you the vocabulary to understand exactly what is being argued underneath the surface of these daily cultural debates. It's the code behind the matrix.
Yeah.
And, well, we always like to leave you with something to chew on, a provocative thought that builds on everything we've explored today.
A final thought.
We started this deep dive talking about the structural foundation of a bridge, the steel and the math required to hold the weight of society. So we leave you with this to mull over. If Riker is right that institutions inherently reflect the demographics that fund and build them, what happens to the legacy infrastructure of the West if the competent producers, the men holding the steel, completely withdraw their participation, their capital, and their labor?
That is the million-dollar question.
Will the so-called institutional parasite adapt, learn to build, and somehow survive on its own? Or will the entire system collapse under the crushing weight of its own administrative bloat?
It is the ultimate inevitable stress test for objective reality. Eventually, gravity wins.
If you want to explore these raw, unapologetic arguments yourself and dive into the exact syllogisms we discussed to understand the history of our institutions before their capture, you need to read this for yourself. Check out Wokezis on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
The author also invites listeners to follow him directly at Conrad Riker on Substack for more incisive writing, cultural analysis, and updates on the parallel polis.
And finally, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our show so we can continue bringing you these ultra-long, fascinating deep dives into the books that are shaping the underground culture. We appreciate you taking the time to explore the complex, uncompromising landscape with us. See you next time.